Good day also from my side. Thank you for organizing this final workshop from the perspective of EDC 2020. I won't bore you too long about what we dealt with in that project, but I think it is, when I was thinking about how work has developed between 2008 and 11, it was actually interesting to see how intelligently that project overarchingly was designed, because what we tried to discuss in that project was what will be the challenges and possible responses of European development policy if we think of the year 2020. So we tried to think of the future. And the work strands we identified, which we thought would be relevant in 2020, was emerging Asia. It was energy security and its relations to fragility, to security, to development, and more generally, and climate change. And when we started our work in the climate change group in 2008, we were witnessing a situation where charged with a lot of uncertainty and a lot of expectations also. I mean, it was before Copenhagen. Just remember how we were discussing about things then. So we thought we would be facing a policy field where revolutionary changes would be possible, where a new perspective, a fundamentally new perspective on development would be possible, because development would be defined from the perspective of low carbon and climate resilience, where possibly development funding would be dwarfed by new large streams of funds coming from donors for climate issues, and where poverty issues would be pushed away from the agenda by climate-related issues. And now, looking back from today, we see what has not happened, and we also see how our thinking at that time was very much still dominated by the perspective of a world dominated by OECD countries. And this, Copenhagen has shown this to us, is not the case anymore. Other countries are strong global players now. This has been mirrored by the process towards the Copenhagen Accord, and I'm sure that it will also shape the way climate and development policy agendas will interact in the future. So I think that we are now that our project was carried out in the beginning of a transition period for where the relations between OECD countries and developing countries, so-called developing countries, will change. This will have a strong influence on development agendas, on economic policy agendas, on climate policy agendas. And it already now makes clear that climate policy, the framing of climate policy, is different. It's very much different today than it was in 1992, when most countries allocated the issue to environmental ministries, and today it is very clearly framed as an issue of economic policy, of energy policy, and therefore also of development opportunities. And myself, being a person who's worked all her professional life on the interface between environment and development, I think this strong economic framing has also gone a little bit to the detriment to the environmental and more sustainability-oriented issues, which are very strong on the adaptation agenda and less strong often on the mitigation agenda, I think. So what I'm trying to say here is that this expectation of fundamental change we had in the beginning of the project was very much influenced by a perspective of OECD countries, traditional donors still being very strong, and I think this will change. And even if we see that pledges for fast start funding are more or less fulfilled, let's let aside the issues of additionality and newness, I'm not so sure how the pledges will really be fulfilled on the midterm, on the 100 billion annually, which have been pledged twice, actually. And it's also not sure, from my perspective, how the division of labor will really look like between private and public funds, between development and climate policy agendas, between mitigation and adaptation. And I think the question at the heart of what we are going to discuss today is, what are the perspectives in developed countries, in developing countries, in different groupings of developing countries on the on the issues of low carbon and climate resilient development. Is this an additional issue on top of development, or is it integrated? Or is it actually changing the perspective on development? I think these are the fundamental issues when we want to understand whether development and climate policy have a chance to get aligned, whether they are competing, whether they will be complementary, and and I think also we have to look at how donors understand this picture and how, well, let's say recipients look at it, because the perspectives are also quite different. And my hypothesis there is that the way donors look at it is also influenced by the way the domestic debate in donor countries on the challenges of climate policy for their own development is shaped. So my perspective on how OECD countries look at that is, if you look at how in our countries climate policy is debated after Cancun, I'm not so sure whether there are really strong alliances towards ambitious climate policies. And the less ambitious our climate policies are on our domestic agendas, the less ambitious our donor policies will be, and the less successful will we be in integrating these different discourses and in having a coherent and consistent perspective on development policies for the year 2020 or even 2050. So I'm saying that the critical mass is not yet there. When we look at the basic countries, so at Brazil, China, India, South Africa, we know that in China there is a strong public policy in favor of renewable energies. There is large public investment, and it's transforming the economy towards low carbon and climate resilience is the strategic aim of the 12th five-year plan, which is being adopted now. So this is, from my perspective, it is a clear and conscious option for low carbon as a strategic paradigm for the next decades. This clear option, I don't see it so clearly in the OECD countries. So this, for sure, will shape how innovation policies, how innovation capacities will be scaled up in China. I see the similar initiatives also in India, in some sectors also in Brazil. And this will be attractive for this will make South-South cooperation even more attractive, I think. So it is there. This is also, for me, a hint that traditional donor dominance is not a given, actually, in this area. And finally, if we look at least developed countries, I think we have to be clear that it's not only adaptation on their agenda, but if we really want to have if we don't want to forget the 2-degree target as a target for limiting global warming, we need to embark on low carbon development in LDCs also, today, not tomorrow, not in 20 years, but today. New scientific analysis of how the carbon budget is looking like makes that very clear. And this, I don't think, has come really through neither to donors nor to general strategic policy debates on economic development. So this, I think, makes it very clear what the challenges are ahead of us for when we talk about climate activities and climate financing at the national level. And so I would like to summarize them. I hope it's not too long. So to get this integrated perspective is one important thing. This is important also when we think about the needs we have identified in the case studies on strengthening national capacities for designing these strategies, for identifying priorities for action, and for coordinated and effective action. I think this is a need at the national level in developing countries, but it's also a need when donors sit together and develop strategies like country assistance strategies or regional strategies or even sectoral strategies. I don't think that donors have enough clarity on where to set priorities and how to do that in an effective and coordinated manner. And I think case studies have shown that visibility needs and a very short-sighted interpretation of what effective action means overrule the need for careful planning, actually, and careful allocation of funds. Most challenges which have been identified for climate finance are very known to us from the development finance picture. I think we are actually maybe repeating the mistakes or having the same difficulties of learning and implementing lessons learned in the climate finance area than we have in the more general development cooperation area. And if you look at the EU as such, it's clear also the EU is could be a very strong actor because it's a large investor in development, but it's not using its full potential for coordinated and strong action, and this is not different in the climate area than it is in the general development area. This is not surprising, but sad to say. So if I now summarize the challenges for donors, I think I would just mention a few points. We need to avoid the risk of aid diversion. Therefore, we need to define additionality. This is also very repetitive, I think, but necessary to say. We need to get much better with regard to predictability and to transparency. This means we need to head at midterm contracts to give partners predictable aid flows over 5 or 7 years. And we need to invest in agreed and joint standards for monitoring and reporting and verification. And this applies to aid in general, not only to climate finance. And I'm not sure whether it makes sense actually to invest only for climate finance. Actually, it would make much more sense to invest in that for development transfers in general, because my perspective is that donors will declare climate finance as ODA. I don't see that this will be the separate strands, really. They will insist on, even if they invest more in climate finance, they will still insist that this is counted towards their 0.7 target, because they need to scratch everything together for actually making some progress towards the situation in the UK is different from other continental donors, but I think that's a general pressure. I think if donors do not manage to fulfill pledges, they should be clear and transparent about that and not pretend they are doing better than they are actually not. I think it's better to be clear and transparent for not destroying trust and confidence. It's better to say, listen, I'm going to fulfill 0.5 of the aid target and then 0.2 of the climate target, but that's as much as I can do, but not mix things up and give a blurred picture of what's actually happening. And then finally, I think we need to try and make progress in making mitigation and adaptation action consistent with poverty reduction. I think this is a challenging target, a challenging objective, but it's necessary if we look at it from an integrated perspective, for example, at the point of delivery. And if we want to, in this picture I have drawn of ODA and climate finance being one pot, and the risks of aid diversion because of diminishing aid budgets, etc. I think this poverty sensitive mitigation and adaptive action is a promising avenue ahead of us, I think. Yeah, that's actually that were my introduction comments, and I also with a view to the debate we will have then later on, and I hope that the case studies we're going to hear about now, I'm sure they will actually give us more stuff to talk about, and keeping in mind what I